August 15th, 1986, Hudson Valley, New York. The morning air along the Hudson River carried the promise of another sweltering summer day. Catherine Ross, a 34-year-old watercolor artist known for her vibrant landscapes, had driven to her favorite painting spot before dawn. By the time the sun fully rose, she had already set up her portable easel, arranged her brushes, and begun capturing the river's morning light on paper. Catherine had built a respectable reputation in the regional art community over the past decade. Her work appeared in galleries throughout the Hudson Valley, and collectors appreciated her unique ability to capture water's movement with delicate brushstrokes. She lived with her husband, David Chen, a gallery owner who had supported her career since they married in 1982. Their life together seemed stable, comfortable, and centered around their shared passion for art. "So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from." That morning, several joggers and early risers noticed Catherine at her usual riverside location. One witness would later tell investigators that she appeared focused on her work, occasionally stepping back to examine her canvas. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing suggested that within hours, Catherine Ross would vanish completely, leaving behind only her equipment and an unfinished painting. By early afternoon, David Chen grew concerned. Catherine typically returned home by lunch, but her car remained absent from their driveway. He tried calling friends and fellow artists, but no one had seen her since the previous evening. As the hours stretched on, his worry intensified. By 6 in the evening, he drove to the riverside location where Catherine often worked. What he found there would transform worry into terror. Catherine's folding chair sat empty, facing the water. Her easel stood upright, holding a partially completed watercolor that was still damp. Her art supplies remained neatly arranged on the small portable table she always brought. Her car was parked nearby, keys still in the ignition, but Catherine herself had disappeared. David immediately contacted local authorities. Police arrived within 20 minutes and began securing the scene. Detective Timothy Morgan, a 15-year veteran of the county sheriff's department, took charge of the investigation. He walked the perimeter carefully, noting every detail. The lack of disturbance puzzled him. If there had been a struggle, surely something would have been knocked over or displaced. Yet everything remained orderly, as if Catherine had simply stood up and walked away. The painting on her easel drew particular attention. It depicted the river scene before her, but something about the color palette seemed unusual for Catherine's typical style. Those familiar with her work commented that she normally used bright, cheerful tones. This piece, however, contained darker shades, murky greens and deep grays that gave the water an almost ominous quality. The painting was perhaps 60% complete, abandoned mid-brushstroke. Search teams combed the riverbank as darkness fell. Volunteers arrived with flashlights, calling Catherine's name into the growing night. Boats equipped with searchlights scanned the water's surface, looking for any sign of her. The search continued through the night and into the following days, expanding outward from the original location. Divers explored the river bottom near where she had been working. Search dogs tracked scents through the surrounding woods. Yet no trace of Catherine Ross emerged. Detective Morgan interviewed everyone who had been near the river that morning. A jogger remembered seeing Catherine around 7:30, working intently on her painting. A fisherman recalled passing by around 9 o'clock and noticing her still at her easel. After that, the timeline went dark. No one admitted to seeing Catherine after 9:15 that morning. The investigation took an interesting turn when Detective Morgan visited Catherine's home studio with David's permission. The studio occupied a converted bedroom, its walls lined with completed works and shelves full of art supplies. Morgan noticed immediately that Catherine kept meticulous records, sketchbooks dated and organized chronologically, careful notes about techniques and color mixtures. But when he examined her recent work, he found something troubling. 3 weeks before her disappearance, Catherine's journal entries became sporadic and cryptic. She mentioned working on a special series of paintings, but provided no details about the subject matter or her inspiration. More significantly, several pages had been torn from the journal, not carelessly, but deliberately removed with what appeared to be a ruler or straight edge to ensure clean extraction. Hidden behind a stack of canvases, Detective Morgan discovered a small envelope containing a handwritten note in Catherine's distinctive script. The message was brief but unsettling. They know about the true colors. The note was undated, and its meaning remained unclear. Morgan carefully bagged it as evidence, though he had no context for understanding its significance. David Chen explained that Catherine had seemed preoccupied in recent weeks. She had joined a local artists' collective a few months earlier, hoping to network with other professionals and perhaps gain exposure for her work. The group met weekly at a studio space rented by Charles Mitchell, an established painter who had lived in the area for several years. David admitted he had never attended these meetings and knew little about the other members. When questioned about the cryptic note, David appeared genuinely confused. He could offer no explanation for what true colors might mean or who they might be. He insisted that Catherine had not mentioned feeling threatened or concerned about anything specific. If she had been worried, she had kept those worries to herself. As the first week of the investigation concluded, Detective Morgan faced a case with more questions than answers. A woman had vanished in broad daylight from a public location, leaving no signs of struggle and no apparent motive for voluntary disappearance. Her personal effects remained untouched. Her car sat waiting. Yet Catherine Ross herself seemed to have evaporated like morning mist on the river. The local media picked up the story, and Catherine's disappearance became regional news. Her photograph appeared in newspapers throughout the Hudson Valley. Television stations ran segments about the missing artist. Tips began flowing into the sheriff's department, though most proved unhelpful. Reported sightings in distant locations that led nowhere, speculation without substance. But one tip would prove more significant than others. An anonymous caller contacted the sheriff's department 3 days after Catherine's disappearance. The caller, a woman who refused to identify herself, claimed that Catherine had been frightened of someone in the artists' collective. The caller suggested investigators look more carefully at the group's activities and at Charles Mitchell specifically. Before the dispatcher could ask follow-up questions, the line went dead. Detective Morgan decided to investigate the artists' collective more thoroughly. What he would discover in the coming days would transform this missing person case into something far more complex and sinister than a simple disappearance by the river. The true colors Catherine had written about were about to reveal themselves in ways no one could have anticipated. September 1986. 3 weeks had passed since Catherine Ross vanished from the riverside, and Detective Timothy Morgan found himself pursuing leads that seemed to multiply rather than converge. The investigation into the artists' collective had opened unexpected doors, revealing a community far more complex than casual weekend painters gathering to share techniques. Charles Mitchell, the group's organizer, was a 42-year-old painter who had relocated to Hudson Valley from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier. His work commanded respectable prices in regional galleries, and he had cultivated a reputation as a mentor to emerging artists. On the surface, Mitchell appeared cooperative with the investigation. He expressed shock at Catherine's disappearance and insisted she had been a valued member of their group. However, background checks revealed details that gave Detective Morgan pause. Mitchell had left Pennsylvania abruptly in 1981, following allegations of art fraud that never resulted in formal charges. Witnesses claimed he had been involved in selling misattributed paintings, but the case collapsed when key evidence disappeared. Mitchell maintained his innocence and suggested the accusations stemmed from professional jealousy. The collective met every Thursday evening at a converted warehouse space that Mitchell rented on the outskirts of town. Detective Morgan attended one of these gatherings, observing the dynamics among the dozen artists who participated regularly. Most were amateur painters or hobbyists, but a few, like Catherine, had achieved professional recognition. Morgan noted how Mitchell commanded attention, offering critiques and advice with confident authority. Several members mentioned that Catherine had grown quieter in recent weeks before her disappearance. She had stopped sharing her new work with the group, claiming it was too personal or not ready for viewing. This behavior marked a change from her earlier participation when she had eagerly sought feedback on her river landscapes. One member, a retired art teacher named Patricia Hughes, pulled Detective Morgan aside after the meeting. She confided that she had witnessed what appeared to be a heated discussion between Catherine and Mitchell approximately 10 days before the disappearance. The conversation had taken place in a corner of the studio after others had left. Patricia could not hear specific words, but noted that Catherine seemed upset, gesturing emphatically while Mitchell remained calm and still. When Patricia approached them, both had fallen silent, and Catherine had gathered her materials and left quickly. Detective Morgan pressed Patricia for more details. Had Catherine mentioned any concerns about Mitchell or the collective? Patricia hesitated before admitting that Catherine had made an odd comment during their last conversation. Catherine had said something about seeing things that did not match up, about numbers that seemed wrong. Patricia had assumed Catherine was referring to something technical about perspective or composition, but now she wondered if the comment held deeper significance. The investigation took a dramatic turn 3 weeks after Catherine's disappearance. A commercial diver named Robert Sanders was conducting routine inspection work on a marina pier approximately 2 miles downstream from where Catherine had been painting. While examining the underwater pilings, Sanders noticed something unusual on the river bottom, a dark shape partially buried in sediment that appeared too regular to be natural debris. After surfacing and reporting his finding, Sanders guided a police dive team to the location. What they recovered sent shockwaves through the investigation. Lying beneath 15 feet of murky water was a leather portfolio case, the kind artists use to transport paintings and drawings. The case had been weighted down with rocks, clearly intended to remain submerged permanently. When the case was carefully opened at the police station, investigators found it contained 6 watercolor paintings. The river water had damaged them significantly, causing colors to run and paper to deteriorate. But enough remained visible to identify the distinctive style and signature of Catherine Ross. These were finished pieces, not studies or sketches, and they appeared to be part of the special series Catherine had mentioned in her journal. David Chen was brought in to examine the recovered paintings. Despite the water damage, he confirmed they were undoubtedly Catherine's work. He recognized her brushwork, her characteristic way of signing pieces in the lower right corner. However, he insisted he had never seen these particular paintings before. Catherine had not shown him this series, and he had no idea what the original subjects might have been before water destroyed much of the detail. Art conservation experts were consulted to see if the paintings could be restored or if any information could be recovered from the damaged paper. Their assessment was sobering. The cold river water and sediment had caused irreversible damage. While the paintings could be stabilized to prevent further deterioration, the original images were largely lost. Only fragments of color and vague shapes remained visible. The discovery of the weighted portfolio raised disturbing questions. If Catherine had voluntarily disappeared, why would her paintings end up in the river? If someone else had disposed of them, what were they trying to hide? The paintings themselves offered few answers in their damaged state, but their presence suggested something darker than a simple missing person case. Detective Morgan authorized expanded searches of the river, focusing on areas downstream from the original scene. Teams dragged the river bottom systematically, searching for anything else that might have been disposed of in the water. The obvious fear, unspoken but present in everyone's mind, was that they might find Catherine's body weighted down like the portfolio. Days passed with no further discoveries. The river, it seemed, had yielded its only secret, those 6 damaged paintings that raised more questions than they answered. Theories proliferated. Had Catherine been involved in something illegal? Had she witnessed something that made her a liability? Had her connection to Charles Mitchell's collective placed her in danger? Detective Morgan obtained a warrant to search Charles Mitchell's studio space more thoroughly. The search revealed a well-organized operation focused on art instruction and sales. Financial records showed income from teaching fees, painting sales, and commissions. Nothing appeared obviously criminal. However, Morgan noted that Mitchell maintained 2 separate sets of client lists, one for students and casual buyers, another containing names of what appeared to be serious collectors and gallery owners. When questioned about the dual record-keeping, Mitchell explained it was simply a business practice to distinguish between different client categories. He became defensive when Morgan pressed for more details, stating that he was being unfairly targeted because of old accusations that had never been proven. Mitchell demanded to know if he was being investigated in connection with Catherine's disappearance, or if this was harassment based on his past. The investigation reached a frustrating stalemate. Without a body, without witnesses to an actual crime, without clear evidence of foul play, the case began to cool. The media attention faded. The volunteer search teams disbanded. David Chen continued to appear on local television periodically, pleading for information about his missing wife, but public interest waned as weeks became months. By late November, the official search for Catherine Ross was scaled back dramatically. Detective Morgan kept the case file open, but resources were redirected to more pressing matters. The prevailing theory among some investigators was that Catherine had staged her own disappearance, possibly fleeing from unknown troubles in her life. The weighted portfolio was explained away as her attempt to dispose of evidence of her plans. Others suspected foul play, but had no solid leads to pursue. The case took an unexpected turn in early December. Neighbors reported that Charles Mitchell had put his property up for sale. Within weeks, Mitchell had sold his house at a price well below market value, liquidated his studio lease, and informed the Artists Collective that he was moving abroad. He claimed a teaching opportunity in France had materialized and was too good to pass up. Detective Morgan found the timing suspicious and attempted to prevent Mitchell from leaving the country, but there was insufficient evidence to justify any legal action. Mitchell had not been charged with any crime. He was not officially a suspect. He was simply a person of interest in a case that lacked concrete direction. By January 1987, Charles Mitchell had departed the United States, settling somewhere in Europe according to travel records. The departure of Mitchell effectively ended the active phase of the investigation. Without new leads, without evidence of homicide, without even confirmation that a crime had occurred, the Catherine Ross case joined the growing files of unsolved disappearances. Detective Morgan retired in 1995, taking with him the frustration of never finding answers about what happened that August morning by the river. The case remained officially open but dormant, another tragic mystery in law enforcement archives. Catherine's painting equipment was eventually returned to David Chen, who could not bear to look at it. He stored everything in his attic, unable to discard it, but equally unable to confront the memories it evoked. Decades would pass before anyone would look at Catherine's artwork with the right eyes, with the right technology, with the right questions. The truth she had tried to document lay hidden beneath layers of pigment and paper, waiting for someone with the skill and determination to reveal what Catherine had risked everything to expose. Those true colors she had written about were not merely artistic choices. They were evidence of something far more sinister than anyone in 1986 could have imagined. March 2023, Manhattan, New York. Nearly 37 years had passed since Catherine Ross disappeared from the banks of the Hudson River. The case had long since faded from public memory, relegated to dusty files in police archives and occasional mentions on websites dedicated to unsolved mysteries. Most people who had known Catherine were either deceased or had moved on with their lives. The art world had forgotten the promising watercolorist whose career ended so abruptly. Rebecca Santos had built her reputation slowly and deliberately over 2 decades. At 41, she was recognized as one of the foremost experts in watercolor restoration on the East Coast. Her specialty involved rescuing damaged historical paintings using cutting-edge conservation techniques combined with traditional methods passed down through generations of art restorers. Museums and private collectors sought her expertise when faced with paintings that seemed beyond salvage. Her Manhattan studio occupied the 3rd floor of a converted factory building in Chelsea. The space contained specialized equipment that would have amazed conservators from earlier eras: digital microscopes, spectral imaging devices, controlled environment chambers, and chemical analysis tools that could identify pigments at the molecular level. Rebecca approached each restoration as both an artist and a scientist, understanding that every brushstroke held historical significance. The assignment that would change everything arrived through a phone call from Holloway Fine Arts, a prestigious gallery that had recently acquired a collection of regional American watercolors from an estate sale. Among the pieces were 6 paintings attributed to Catherine Ross, an artist the gallery researcher had identified as someone with local significance in the Hudson Valley during the 1980s. The paintings had suffered water damage at some point in their history and required professional restoration before they could be displayed or sold. Rebecca accepted the commission without knowing the painting's connection to an unsolved disappearance. The gallery representative mentioned only that the works had been recovered from storage in poor condition and that previous attempts at conservation had been minimal. When the paintings arrived at her studio, carefully packaged and insured, Rebecca began her standard assessment process. The damage was immediately apparent and extensive. Water had caused the paper to buckle and warp. Pigments had run and blurred, creating muddy areas where distinct images once existed. Mold had taken hold in several spots, leaving brown stains across the surfaces. To the untrained eye, these paintings might have seemed worthless, too damaged to be worth the expense of restoration. But Rebecca saw potential in the fragments that remained. She photographed each painting thoroughly, documenting every aspect of the damage. Then she began the painstaking process of testing small areas to determine which conservation methods might be effective. Different papers responded differently to treatments. Some pigments could be stabilized while others were too degraded to save. Each painting presented unique challenges. During the third day of assessment, Rebecca decided to examine the paintings under ultraviolet light. This technique often revealed previous repairs, underdrawings, or alterations invisible to the naked eye. UV examination was standard practice in her field, a routine step in understanding a painting's history and structure. She dimmed the studio lights, positioned the UV lamp, and began scanning the first painting. What appeared on that damaged watercolor made Rebecca lean closer, uncertain if she was seeing correctly. Beneath the visible layer of river scene painting, the UV light revealed faint marks that seemed deliberately placed. At first, she thought they might be underdrawing, preliminary sketches artists sometimes made before applying watercolor. But as she examined more carefully, Rebecca realized these were not sketch lines. They were words, letters, and numbers, carefully written in what appeared to be a substance that fluoresced under UV light but remained invisible under normal viewing conditions. Rebecca's heart rate increased as she understood the significance. Someone had written messages on this watercolor using invisible ink, a technique dating back centuries but rarely encountered in modern artwork. The writing was partially obscured by the water damage that had affected the visible painting, but portions remained legible. She moved methodically through all 6 paintings, examining each under the UV lamp. Every single one contained hidden text. The messages were fragmentary and cryptic, but certain words appeared repeatedly: transfers, accounts, falsified, authentication. Rebecca also noted what appeared to be names, though some were abbreviated or written in a code she could not immediately decipher. Rebecca contacted the gallery immediately to report her finding. The gallery director was stunned. He knew nothing about hidden messages and had purchased the paintings purely for their attributed artistic merit, despite their damaged condition. He authorized Rebecca to continue her investigation and documentation, recognizing that the paintings had suddenly become far more valuable and significant than anyone had realized. A colleague at Rebecca's studio suggested contacting law enforcement, given that the hidden messages seemed to reference illegal activities. Rebecca hesitated, wanting to document everything thoroughly before involving authorities. She spent the next week carefully photographing the UV-revealed text, transcribing every legible word, and researching historical context about invisible ink techniques in watercolor painting. Her research revealed that artists had occasionally used invisible inks for various purposes, signing forgeries in ways that could later prove their authorship, embedding secret messages during wartime, or documenting information they wanted to conceal. The practice required knowledge of chemistry and access to specific substances that would remain invisible under normal conditions but reveal themselves under UV light or chemical treatment. As Rebecca pieced together fragments of text from across the 6 paintings, a troubling picture emerged. The messages referenced financial transactions, the movement of artwork between parties, and discrepancies in documentation. One phrase appeared on 3 different paintings: authentication process compromised. Another repeated message referenced gallery sales records that did not match actual inventory. Rebecca discovered something else during her examination: a sequence of numbers that appeared on the corner of one painting. The numbers were formatted in a way that suggested geographic coordinates. She input them into mapping software and found they pointed to a location in rural Dutchess County, New York, roughly 40 miles from where Catherine Ross had disappeared in 1986. The more Rebecca learned about Catherine Ross through online research, the more disturbed she became. Here was an artist who had vanished without explanation, leaving behind a mystery that had never been solved. And here were her paintings, containing hidden messages about fraud and illegal activities, recovered from the river where she was last seen. The connection seemed impossible to ignore. Rebecca made the decision to contact the New York State Police. She prepared a comprehensive report documenting her findings, including high-resolution photographs of the UV-revealed text, transcriptions of legible passages, and her analysis of the invisible ink technique used. She also included the geographic coordinates and her hypothesis that Catherine Ross had deliberately embedded these messages as evidence of crimes she had discovered. The case was assigned to Detective James Cooper, a veteran investigator with the State Police Cold Case Unit. Cooper had spent 15 years reviewing unsolved cases, applying modern forensic techniques to old mysteries. When he read Rebecca's report and examined the photographs of the hidden messages, he immediately recognized the potential significance. This was not merely an interesting historical curiosity. This was potential evidence in an unsolved missing person case. Detective Cooper requested access to the original case file from 1986. What he read there connected dots that had remained separate for nearly 4 decades. Catherine Ross had been involved with an artists' collective. She had seemed preoccupied before her disappearance. A cryptic note in her handwriting had referenced true colors, and Charles Mitchell, the collective organizer with a questionable past, had left the country shortly after Catherine vanished. Cooper contacted Rebecca and arranged to examine the paintings in person. Standing in her studio, looking at the watercolors under UV light, he felt the familiar electricity of a case breaking open. Catherine Ross had not simply been a victim. She had been a documenter, a witness who had used her art to create an enduring record of crimes she had uncovered. The question now was whether her documentation could finally reveal not only what she had discovered, but also what had happened to her. The investigation that followed would pull together threads from 1986 and 2023, connecting art fraud with a disappearance and revealing a conspiracy that had remained hidden for decades. But first, Detective Cooper needed to follow those coordinates Rebecca had discovered. Coordinates that pointed to a piece of property that, according to land records, had once been owned by an LLC connected to Charles Mitchell's art collective. What lay at that location would transform everything investigators thought they knew about Catherine Ross's final days. April 2023, Dutchess County, New York. Detective James Cooper stood at the edge of an overgrown property, comparing the landscape before him with satellite imagery on his tablet. The coordinates Rebecca Santos had discovered in Catherine Ross's hidden messages pointed precisely to this location, a 12-acre parcel that had changed hands multiple times since 1986 and now sat abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by forest. Property records told an interesting story. In 1985, an LLC called Riverside Arts Holdings had purchased the land and the small building that occupied it. The LLC's registered agents included Charles Mitchell and 2 other individuals whose names had appeared in Detective Timothy Morgan's original investigation notes, gallery owners who had been questioned about their business relationships with Mitchell's Artists Collective. The building itself was a modest structure, originally constructed as a storage facility for a farming operation. By the time Riverside Arts Holdings acquired it, the property had been rezoned for commercial use. According to permits filed with the county, the LLC had renovated the building to serve as a private gallery and storage space for artwork. The business had operated quietly for approximately 2 years before closing in late 1986. Detective Cooper had obtained a warrant to search the property, though he harbored realistic doubts about finding anything significant after 37 years of abandonment. Weather, vandals, and time had likely destroyed any evidence that might once have existed. Still, the coordinates Catherine Ross had hidden in her painting demanded investigation. A forensic team accompanied Cooper to the site, equipped with ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and tools for structural examination. The building's roof had partially collapsed, and vegetation had infiltrated through broken windows. Inside, debris covered the floor, rotted wood, scattered trash from trespassers, and remnants of the building's former use. The team spent 2 days conducting a methodical search. The ground-penetrating radar revealed the building's foundation structure and several areas where the soil composition appeared disturbed, suggesting previous excavation. These anomalies were marked for potential excavation if other evidence warranted such intensive investigation. In what had apparently served as an office, investigators found metal filing cabinets too rusted to open without tools. When finally pried apart, the cabinets yielded water-damaged papers, invoices, correspondence, and business records from the mid-1980s. Most documents were illegible, reduced to pulpy masses by years of moisture exposure. However, some papers that had been on top of stacks or near cabinet edges retained partial legibility. A forensic documents examiner was brought in to assess what could be recovered. Using careful drying techniques and digital enhancement, the examiner managed to reconstruct portions of several documents. What emerged was evidence of a sophisticated operation involving the sale of artwork through the private gallery at this location. The invoices showed paintings being sold for substantial sums, often tens of thousands of dollars per piece. The artists listed included some recognizable names from the regional art scene, but many were individuals whose work should not have commanded such high prices based on their actual market reputation. The discrepancy suggested these sales were not entirely legitimate. Detective Cooper cross-referenced the names on these invoices with the list of artists who had participated in Charles Mitchell's collective. Approximately 60% matched. The pattern indicated that Mitchell's group was not simply a gathering of artists sharing techniques and inspiration. It was a pipeline feeding artwork into a sales operation designed for purposes beyond legitimate art commerce. Financial investigators who reviewed the recovered documents identified classic signs of money laundering through art sales. Artificially inflated prices, buyers whose identities were obscured through shell companies, and rapid transactions that moved money through the gallery without legitimate business justification. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Artwork provided a veneer of legitimacy for moving illicit funds. Catherine Ross's hidden messages began making more sense in this context. She had written about falsified authentication, compromised processes, and transfers that did not match records. She had discovered that her own work, and that of her fellow artists, was being exploited as part of a financial fraud operation. The question was how she had uncovered this information and what she had planned to do with her knowledge. Cooper's investigation expanded to include financial records from 1986. Banks had long since purged most detailed transaction data from that era, but archived tax documents and business filings provided some insight. Riverside Arts Holdings had reported income consistent with an active gallery operation, but had dissolved shortly after Catherine Ross's disappearance. The timing seemed more than coincidental. The detective located and interviewed several artists who had been part of Mitchell's collective in 1986. Most were now in their 60s or 70s, and their memories of events from decades earlier were understandably hazy. However, one former member, Michael Torres, provided information that proved crucial to understanding the operation. Torres explained that Mitchell had offered members of the collective an appealing arrangement. He would handle all business aspects of selling their work, finding buyers, negotiating prices, and managing transactions. Artists would receive 60% of sale prices, with Mitchell keeping 40% for his services. For struggling artists trying to make a living from their work, this seemed like a fair deal. What Torres and others had not understood at the time was that the prices Mitchell claimed to be receiving for their work were often fabricated. An artist might be told their painting sold for $3,000 and receive $1,800 as their share. In reality, the painting might have been sold for $500 to a legitimate buyer, or it might have been sold for $15,000 to someone using the purchase to launder money. The artists had no visibility into the actual transactions. Torres recalled that Catherine Ross had been more business-minded than most collective members. She had asked detailed questions about sales, requested copies of invoices, and wanted to understand the gallery's client base. Mitchell had initially accommodated her curiosity, but according to Torres, tensions had developed in the months before Catherine's disappearance. The breakthrough in the investigation came from an unexpected source. David Chen, now 71 years old and living in Oregon under the surname Wang following a remarriage, had been following news coverage of the reopened investigation online. He contacted Detective Cooper with information he had withheld in 1986 out of fear and confusion. Chen explained that 2 days before Catherine disappeared, she had told him she needed to show him something important, but that she wanted to wait until she had completed documentation of what she had discovered. She had seemed nervous, but also determined, and she had made him promise that if anything happened to her, he should look for her River series paintings. Specifically, she told him the paintings contained everything anyone would need to understand what she had found. When Catherine disappeared and her paintings were later recovered from the river, Chen had examined them but saw only water-damaged artwork. He had not known about the hidden messages written in invisible ink. The technology to easily detect such messages had not been widely available in 1986, and investigators at the time had no reason to look for them. Chen had assumed Catherine's instruction about the paintings referred to some meaning in the images themselves that he was failing to perceive. Chen also revealed something he had kept secret for 37 years. Approximately 1 week after Catherine's disappearance, he had received a phone call from someone who did not identify themselves. The caller had told him that continuing to search for Catherine would be dangerous and that he should accept that she was gone. The caller had suggested that if Chen examined his wife's activities too closely, he might discover things that would complicate both her memory and his own future. Frightened and grieving, Chen had not reported this call to police. Armed with this new information and the evidence from the property search, Detective Cooper built a comprehensive picture of what had happened in 1986. Catherine Ross had discovered the money laundering operation running through Mitchell's gallery. She had documented evidence using a technique that would preserve it even if her notes or papers were destroyed. She had been planning to go to authorities with her findings. And before she could do so, someone had silenced her. The investigation now faced a critical challenge. Charles Mitchell had fled to Argentina in 1987 and had lived there for decades. Extradition from Argentina was notoriously difficult, and tracking someone who had been gone for over 30 years would require significant resources. However, Detective Cooper's research revealed something surprising. Mitchell had returned to the United States in 2019. Immigration records showed that Charles Mitchell, now 78 years old, had re-entered the country legally through Miami International Airport. He had maintained Argentine citizenship, but had never renounced his American citizenship. He had been living quietly in Florida for 4 years, apparently believing that enough time had passed for him to return without fear of facing consequences for events in 1986. Cooper applied for warrants for Mitchell's arrest and for searches of his current residence. The charges included conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice related to Catherine Ross's disappearance. While the state had no direct physical evidence linking Mitchell to Catherine's death, the circumstantial evidence was substantial. His flight from the country, the financial fraud operation, Catherine's documented concerns, and the threatening phone call to her husband. When Florida police arrested Mitchell at his apartment in Miami, they found a man who had aged into seeming frailty, but whose eyes still held sharp intelligence. He invoked his right to remain silent immediately and requested an attorney. In his apartment, investigators found file boxes containing documents from his years in Argentina, including journals and correspondence that would take weeks to fully analyze. One document, however, stood out immediately. It was a letter Mitchell had written but apparently never sent, dated 1995 and addressed to no one in particular. In it, Mitchell reflected on his life and the choices he had made. He wrote about the art world, about the fine line between entrepreneurship and fraud, and about how sometimes people get caught in situations that spiral beyond their control. The letter did not constitute a confession, but it revealed a man who had lived with burden of knowledge and guilt for decades. The arrest made national news, and the story of Catherine Ross, the artist who had hidden evidence in her paintings, captured public imagination. Rebecca Santos found herself interviewed by media outlets about her discovery and the restoration work that had cracked open a cold case. The art world buzzed with discussions about invisible messages in paintings and whether other artists throughout history might have embedded similar secrets in their work. But the most important question remained unanswered. Mitchell's arrest addressed the fraud operation and the conspiracy, but it did not reveal what had actually happened to Catherine Ross on that August morning in 1986. Without a body, without witnesses, without a confession, the prosecution faced challenges in bringing murder charges. Detective Cooper knew that solving the mystery completely would require one more breakthrough, and that breakthrough would come from an unexpected conversation between two old men who had kept secrets for far too long. May 2023, Miami Federal Detention Center. Charles Mitchell sat across from his attorney in a consultation room, reviewing the evidence prosecutors had assembled against him. The case was formidable. Financial records, witness statements, and most damaging of all, Catherine Ross's hidden messages that documented the fraud operation in meticulous detail. Mitchell's attorney advised him that cooperation might be his only viable strategy to avoid spending his remaining years in prison. Meanwhile, Detective James Cooper was pursuing another lead that had emerged from Mitchell's arrest. Among the documents seized from Mitchell's Miami apartment was an address book containing names from his past. One name caught Cooper's attention: David Chen, listed with a current Oregon phone number. This puzzled Cooper briefly until he remembered that Chen had changed his surname to Wang after remarrying. Cooper contacted Chen again, and during their conversation, Chen revealed something significant. He had maintained sporadic contact with Mitchell over the years, though he had never mentioned this to investigators in 1986. The contact had begun with a letter Mitchell sent from Argentina in 1988, expressing condolences about Catherine and suggesting that both men had lost something irreplaceable. Chen had responded, and an irregular correspondence had developed. Chen explained his reasoning for maintaining this connection. Part of him had suspected Mitchell's involvement in Catherine's disappearance, but another part had hoped that by staying in contact, he might eventually learn the truth. Over the years, Mitchell had never explicitly admitted anything, but he had made oblique references to the past and to burdens that grew heavier with age. Detective Cooper saw an opportunity. He arranged for Chen to visit Mitchell at the detention center, with law enforcement monitoring the conversation. Chen agreed, motivated by the same desire for answers that had kept him connected to Mitchell for decades. The meeting was framed as a personal visit from an old acquaintance, but both men understood its true purpose. The conversation began cautiously, with Mitchell clearly aware that his words might be used against him. He asked about Chen's life, his remarriage, his health. Chen reciprocated with questions about Mitchell's time in Argentina and his return to the United States. The exchange was cordial, but laden with unspoken tension. Then, Chen shifted the conversation to Catherine. He explained that her paintings had been examined with modern technology and that the hidden messages had been discovered. He told Mitchell that investigators now understood the full scope of the fraud operation. He said that after 37 years, he simply wanted to know what had happened to his wife so that he could finally achieve some measure of peace. Mitchell's composure began to crack. He acknowledged that the situation in 1986 had spiraled beyond anyone's control. He admitted that the gallery operation had indeed been a money laundering scheme, designed to move funds for clients who needed to legitimize income from various sources. He confirmed that Catherine had discovered the operation and had been documenting evidence. Then Mitchell revealed the crucial detail. He was not the person who had confronted Catherine on the morning she disappeared. That encounter had involved another member of the operation, a man named Robert Hayes, who had been one of the silent partners in Riverside Arts Holdings. Hayes had learned that Catherine was planning to go to authorities, and he had taken it upon himself to prevent her from exposing the operation. Mitchell claimed he had not ordered or condoned what Hayes did, but he had helped conceal it afterward because he feared being implicated. Hayes had told him that Catherine's death had been accidental, the result of a confrontation that escalated beyond what he had intended. Whether this was true or a convenient fiction, Mitchell said he never knew for certain. According to Mitchell, Hayes had disposed of Catherine's body in the Hudson River, weighted down to ensure it would not surface. He had driven her vehicle to the Riverside location, where she usually painted and staged the scene to appear as though she had simply vanished. the portfolio of paintings had been thrown in the river separately, intended to sink and disappear forever. The fact that it was eventually found had been an unforeseen complication. Mitchell provided the location where he believed Catherine's body had been placed in the river, approximately 15 miles downstream from where she had been painting, in a section where the current was strong and the water deep. He explained that Hayes had chosen this location because commercial diving operations occasionally worked in the area, and he had worried that a body disposed of elsewhere might eventually be discovered by recreational divers or fishermen. Detective Cooper immediately organized a search operation. The Hudson River section Mitchell had identified was now considerably different from how it had been in 1986. Decades of sediment deposition had altered the river bottom, and development along the shore had changed the landscape. However, sonar technology had advanced dramatically since the original search, and specialized equipment could now detect anomalies that would have been invisible in earlier searches. The search team included police divers, forensic specialists, and experts in underwater recovery. They worked systematically, dividing the indicated area into grid sections and scanning each thoroughly. The work was painstaking and difficult, conducted in murky water with limited visibility and complicated by debris and natural obstacles. On the fourth day of searching, sonar detected a large metallic object resting on the river bottom beneath substantial sediment accumulation. Initial investigation revealed it to be a vehicle, a car that had been submerged for decades. The discovery sent a surge of grim anticipation through the investigative team. Specialized equipment was brought in to stabilize and recover the vehicle. The process took 2 additional days, as investigators worked carefully to preserve any evidence that might remain after nearly 4 decades underwater. When the car was finally lifted from the river, water poured from every opening, carrying with it sediment and debris that had accumulated over the years. The vehicle was identified as a 1984 sedan that had been reported stolen in August 1986, just days after Catherine Ross's disappearance. Inside the vehicle, forensic teams made the discovery they had been seeking and dreading. Human remains, reduced by time and water to skeletal fragments, were recovered from what had been the trunk of the car. The remains were transported to the State Forensic Laboratory for analysis. Despite the deterioration caused by decades of submersion, forensic anthropologists were able to determine that the remains were consistent with a female in her 30s. Dental records confirmed what investigators already believed. These were the remains of Catherine Ross. Forensic examination revealed additional crucial information. The skull showed evidence of blunt force trauma, fractures consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The injury pattern suggested this trauma had occurred before the body entered the water, supporting Mitchell's claim that Catherine had died during a confrontation rather than from drowning. The medical examiner classified the death as homicide. With Catherine's body recovered and Mitchell's statement providing details about the crime, Detective Cooper moved to locate Robert Hayes. Records showed that Hayes had died in 2003 from natural causes, taking his direct knowledge of that August morning to the grave. However, Hayes's death did not prevent prosecutors from pursuing justice for Catherine Ross. Charles Mitchell was now charged with accessory to murder, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and numerous fraud-related offenses. His cooperation in locating Catherine's body would be considered during sentencing, but he would face significant prison time. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His own statements, the financial records, Catherine's documented accusations, and the physical evidence recovered from the river. David Chen received the notification that his wife's remains had been identified. After 37 years of not knowing, of holding on to hope while simultaneously accepting loss, he finally had certainty. Catherine had not abandoned him. She had not run away to start a new life. She had been murdered while trying to expose criminal activity, and her body had been hidden in the river she had loved to paint. The recovery of Catherine's remains provided closure, but also raised new questions about justice delayed. How many cases like this existed? Crimes concealed by time, truth buried beneath water and sediment, and years of silence. How many families lived without answers because investigations had lacked the technology or persistence to find them? Rebecca Santos, whose skill in art restoration had triggered this entire sequence of events, attended the press conference where Detective Cooper announced the case resolution. She thought about Catherine Ross, who had used her artistic knowledge to create a permanent record that could survive even her own death. The hidden messages had waited patiently for someone with the right tools and the right questions to reveal them. As the investigation concluded, one final element of Catherine's plan came to light. Among the UV-revealed messages on her paintings was a brief note that had gone unnoticed during initial examination. Written in tiny letters along the edge of one watercolor were words that now seemed like a message across time. Truth outlasts those who try to hide it. Catherine had known the risk she was taking, and she had prepared for the possibility that she might not survive to present her evidence personally. Her art had become her testimony, and 37 years later, that testimony had achieved its purpose. September 2024. United States District Court, Southern District of New York. The trial of Charles Mitchell drew significant public attention, not only for the tragic story it encompassed, but also for its unusual evidentiary foundation. At the center of the prosecution's case were 6 watercolor paintings that had spent decades damaged and forgotten before revealing their hidden messages through modern technology. Rebecca Santos was called as an expert witness to explain the invisible ink technique Catherine Ross had employed. She demonstrated for the jury how UV light revealed writing that remained invisible under normal conditions. She explained that Catherine had used a fluorescent compound, likely derived from plant materials, that would bond with watercolor paper but not degrade the visible painting on its surface. The technique showed sophisticated knowledge of both chemistry and art conservation. The prosecution presented the case methodically, building a comprehensive picture of the money laundering operation, Catherine's discovery of the scheme, and the conspiracy to silence her. Financial experts testified about the fraudulent transactions that had moved through Riverside Arts Holdings. Former members of the Artists Collective described the operation and Mitchell's role in managing sales. David Chen testified about Catherine's behavior in the weeks before her disappearance, her cryptic warnings, and the threatening phone call he had received after she vanished. His testimony was emotionally powerful, describing 37 years of living with uncertainty and the complicated grief of not knowing whether to hope or to mourn. The defense attempted to minimize Mitchell's culpability, arguing that he had been a minor participant in a larger criminal enterprise and that the actual violence had been committed by Robert Hayes, who was beyond the reach of justice. Mitchell's attorney emphasized his client's cooperation in locating Catherine's remains and his expression of remorse for the role he had played in concealing the crime. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with their verdict. Charles Mitchell was found guilty on all counts: accessory to murder after the fact, conspiracy to commit fraud, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of money laundering. The conviction carried a potential sentence of life in prison. At sentencing, the judge considered both the severity of Mitchell's crimes and his cooperation with investigators. The judge noted that Mitchell had lived freely for decades, while Catherine Ross's family had suffered without answers. The judge acknowledged Mitchell's assistance in recovering Catherine's body, but emphasized that this cooperation did not erase the initial crime or the years of concealment. Charles Mitchell was sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. At 78 years old, the sentence effectively meant he would spend the remainder of his life incarcerated. The judge imposed additional restitution requirements, ordering Mitchell to pay damages to Catherine's estate and to other victims of the fraud scheme who could be identified. The conviction brought a measure of closure to a case that had haunted investigators for nearly 4 decades. Detective James Cooper, who had led the modern investigation, reflected on how technology and persistence had solved a case that seemed impossible in 1986. Ground-penetrating radar, UV imaging, DNA analysis, and digital records had provided tools that earlier investigators lacked. Catherine Ross's remains were released to her family for burial. A memorial service was held in Hudson Valley, attended by members of the art community, law enforcement officers who had worked on the case, and people who had followed the story through media coverage. David Chen, now 72, spoke about his wife's talent, her integrity, and her courage in standing up against corruption, even when it put her at risk. The 6 watercolor paintings that had contained Catherine's hidden messages became the subject of significant interest from museums and art institutions. After the trial concluded, David Chen donated the paintings to a regional art museum in Hudson Valley, with the stipulation that they be displayed together with information about Catherine's life and the role the paintings played in solving her murder. The museum created a permanent exhibition titled Hidden Truth, Catherine Ross and the Art of Evidence. The exhibition displayed the paintings along with UV light viewers that allowed visitors to see the hidden messages for themselves. Educational materials explain the invisible ink technique and discuss the broader themes of art as documentation and the intersection of creativity and justice. Rebecca Santos received recognition from professional conservation organizations for her work in discovering the hidden messages. She became a sought-after speaker at conferences, discussing not only the technical aspects of her discovery, but also the ethical responsibilities of art restorers when they encounter unexpected findings. Her work on the Catherine Ross case established new protocols for examining historical artwork with modern technology. The case also prompted law enforcement agencies to review other cold cases involving artists, writers, or individuals who might have documented crimes in unconventional ways. Several other investigations were reopened based on the principle that evidence might exist in forms that earlier investigators had not thought to examine. For the art community, Catherine Ross became a symbol of integrity and courage. Her story was taught in art schools as an example of how artists might use their skills to document truth and resist corruption. Some artists created works inspired by her hidden messages, exploring themes of concealment and revelation, visible and invisible truths. The money laundering operation that had cost Catherine her life was thoroughly dismantled through the investigation. Federal prosecutors brought charges against several individuals who had used Riverside Arts Holdings to launder funds, though many of the original participants were deceased or beyond the reach of American jurisdiction. The case resulted in policy discussions about regulations governing art sales and the potential for the art market to facilitate financial crimes. David Chen established a foundation in Catherine's memory, supporting emerging watercolor artists and funding programs that taught art to at-risk youth. He explained that Catherine had believed deeply in art's power to reveal truth and beauty, and he wanted her legacy to reflect those values. The foundation awarded annual scholarships to young artists who demonstrated both talent and commitment to using their work to make positive social contributions. The resolution of Catherine Ross's case demonstrated that justice, though sometimes delayed, could still be achieved through the combination of old evidence and new technology, persistent investigation, and fortunate discovery. Her paintings had waited patiently for someone to ask the right questions and look in the right ways. When that moment finally came, 37 years after her death, Catherine's voice spoke clearly from beneath layers of watercolor and time. The story concluded not with complete victory. Robert Hayes had escaped earthly justice, and decades of suffering could not be undone, but with acknowledgement that truth matters, that the disappeared deserve to be found, and that evidence can take forms as creative and enduring as those who create it. Catherine Ross had painted her testimony in colors both visible and invisible, ensuring that even if she could not present her case in person, her art would speak for her when the time came. The Hudson River continued to flow past the spot where Catherine had last set up her easel, its waters carrying forward as they always had, indifferent to human tragedy and triumph. But the community along its banks remembered the artist who had documented truth in watercolor and invisible ink, who had risked everything to expose corruption, and whose final paintings had become evidence that transcended death itself. Her legacy endured not only in the beauty she had created, but in the justice her creativity had ultimately secured.